Hey friends, Lacey Camp. This is no small endeavor. Ben Cohen, founder of the ice cream company Ben & Jerry's, came up in a recent interview. I was out in California interviewing Catholic peace activist John Deere. John mentioned in telling stories about his friends, the Berrigan brothers, that Daniel Berrigan had once done a commercial for Ben & Jerry's and was gifted a lifetime supply of ice cream in exchange, which is a funny sort of picture to imagine that great radical peace activist enjoying his Ben & Jerry's. So anyway, that got us thinking about Ben Cohen again, and we're enjoying doing these best of releases. And so I hope that you enjoy this particular episode with Ben Cohen that we've woven together with Jay Jakub of the Economics of Mutuality based over in Switzerland. A lot to say about peace, love, money, and ice cream. And I had a great time going up to see Ben Cohen there in Burlington, Vermont on a beautiful lake on that spectacular day. As always, you can reach me at lee@nosmallendeavor.com. I'm Lee C. Camp, and this is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life.
Normally, business is just measuring its success by profit. We were going to change that and develop a two-part bottom line, which is how much have we helped to improve the quality of life in the community and how much profit have we made.
That's Ben Cohen, co-founder of world-famous Ben & Jerry's Ice Cream and a vocal activist for peace and justice.
It's time to really create a more complete form of capitalism by enlarging the definition of performance to include not only financial capital, but also other forms of capital that are non-financial in nature that have significant value.
And that is Jay Jakub, Chief Advocacy Officer for Economics of Mutuality. Today, peace, love, money, and ice cream. Coming right up. I'm Lee C. Camp. This is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life. As a college professor in the field of ethics, I often come across those who speak about right and wrong the way one might speak about their favorite and least favorite ice cream flavors, as a relative matter of taste that may or may not be based on a thing's real-world benefits and consequences. Turns out there's actually a theory among moral philosophers that describes this view of right and wrong. It's called emotivism, that to say such and so is morally right is the same sort of statement as saying Ben & Jerry's Tonight Dough is the best ice cream. On the other end, there are those who speak about right and wrong as if they are indeed hard and fast laws, but that such moral imperatives are some sort of arbitrary, capricious imposition of maybe a dogmatic God. God said you better, and it doesn't matter whether those commands make any sense at all. There's yet another option, which we'll explore today, which presumes that the field of ethics is at its best when it explores the nature of human flourishing. That is, that ethics ought to ask questions about what sorts of habits, practices, even rules of life lead to a person doing well, flourishing, and beyond individual persons, what it looks like for a community to flourish. In other words, this third approach presumes there is at least some substantive correlation between what is theoretically right and what is practically good. And these approaches that keep human and communal flourishing at the center of their ethical reflection turn out to raise some fascinating possibilities about many, even all, facets of our lives. Even in the field of business.
When we first got into business, we felt like business was essentially a machine for making money.
That's Ben Cohen, co-founder and former CEO of Ben & Jerry's Ice Cream. Ben is the co-creator of some of what I consider the world's finest ice cream concoctions, and yes, I decided to do a fair amount of experiential research leading into my interview, which I conducted with him there in Vermont. Their tonight dough, as I indicated earlier, and their chocolate chip cookie dough are surely a temptation unto at least one of the 7 deadly sins. But Ben and his partner Jerry have been proponents of a business model which runs counter to a great deal of business orthodoxy.
At the very beginning, we were just a little homemade ice cream shop, and we were active in our community. We were sponsoring community events, etc. But as the company got larger, we realized that we had a platform that people were willing to listen to what we had to say. And we felt like if people were going to come to talk with us, we would talk about what's really important. I know it's a little hard to believe, but some things in life are more important than ice cream. And if we wanted to be of as much benefit to the community as possible, we needed to give away as much money as possible. And we were giving away 7.5% of our pre-tax profits, which is the highest amount of any publicly held corporation.
In the context of the late 20th century business world, this decision seems to make almost zero sense. Here we have a growing company with annual revenue exceeding $100 million by the early 1990s, and yet they are giving away 7.5% of their pre-tax profits. For a frame of reference, the average at the time was 1.5%.
And we realized that, we were making all these grants, but it was really just a drop in the bucket. I mean, that the needs of the society are so huge that giving away, a few 100,000 or a few million a year isn't really going to solve the problem. So we started looking at, how else could we work on these issues? We realized that if we could figure out a way to integrate social concerns into our day-to-day business activities, that would be way, way more powerful.
And so they began their effort to combine social concerns into the day-to-day of their business. They started at the bottom of the ladder and worked their way up.
So in terms of how we buy our ingredients, it's fair traded, and we're supporting organizations that there's one called the Greyston Bakery in Yonkers, New York, that is a bakery that was actually started by a religious organization, and they have this commercial bakery. And we deliberately decided to source our brownies for our chocolate fudge brownie ice cream from them in order to help them with their mission, which is to provide employment opportunities for formerly unemployable people, ex-convicts, ex-drug addicts, people living in poverty. We have a bunch of scoop shops that are operated by nonprofit social service organizations that are working with at-risk youth. So the more we can integrate social concerns into our day-to-day activities, it's not dependent on generosity or donations. It's just how we do business, and it doesn't cost us any money.
You said the process was slow. What were your practices or habits or the process like through which you came to see different elements that you could then begin naturally building into your venture?
Normally business is just measuring its success by profit, how much money is left over at the end of each month. We said that we were going to change that and develop a 2-part bottom line, which is how much have we helped to improve the quality of life in the community, and how much profit have we made?
Naturally, there was a lot of pushback regarding the idea of a 2-part bottom line.
At the beginning, it was quite controversial at the company, and people thought that, trying to help the community was going to take away from profits, and the focus on profits was going to take away from helping the community. And we found that we were able to find ways of choosing courses of action that had a positive impact on both parts of the bottom line.
A former student of mine knew that I was going to interview Ben and asked me to put a question to him. As you may know, there is a great disparity in many American companies between the lowest wage worker in an organization and the top CEOs. Ben and Jerry kept CEO pay at a maximum of only 7 times higher than that of their lowest wage workers before selling their company. The American average for CEO pay these days is something like 350 times more than the lowest wage worker of a company, and sometimes as much as 1,500 times higher. So my student wanted me to ask Ben, what is a reasonable maximum wage in the USA?
I haven't thought about what a reasonable maximum wage is. At the time when we instituted our compressed salary ratio, the norm, spread between CEO and line worker pay was 40 to 1. And we thought that was outrageous. Now it's 10 times that. So, CEOs currently are getting paid, hundreds of millions of dollars, probably more. Nobody needs that much money. It's absurd. I mean, when we think about probably the biggest problem in our society is the increasing spread in wealth between rich and poor. That's a big thing that's driving it. And then the other thing that we realized is that probably business's most powerful tool is its voice. That when business speaks, the press listens, the politicians listen, the community listens. And so we've been trying to use that voice for justice.
You're listening to No Small Endeavor and our episode, Peace, Love, Money, and Ice Cream. I love hearing from you. Tell us what you're reading, who you're paying attention to, or send us feedback about today's episode. You can reach me at lee@nosmallendeavor.com. You can get show notes for this episode in your podcast app or wherever you listen. These notes include links to resources mentioned in this episode and a PDF of complete interview notes, oftentimes including material not found in the given episode, as well as a link to a transcript. Coming up, we'll hear from Jay Jakub about how, even in business, the so-called ethical might also be practical. No Small Endeavor is supported by Lipscomb University, located in Nashville, Tennessee. Students at Lipscomb join a welcoming community that shines the light of Christ to magnify the best in each person. A refining academic experience enriched by spiritual and vocational formation prepares students for a life of purpose. You can learn more about Lipscomb and even schedule a visit at lipscomb.edu. We just heard from Ben Cohen of world-famous Ben and Jerry's Ice Cream about the ways in which he and Jerry developed their company counter to the profit-based metrics of their day in favor of what he calls a two-part bottom line.
The goal was to integrate social concerns into as many of our day-to-day business activities as possible. And really what we used as the impetus for that was to change the way that we measured the success of our business. Normally business is just measuring its success by profit, how much money is left over at the end of each month. We said that we were going to change that and develop a two-part bottom line, which is how much have we helped to improve the quality of life in the community, and how much profit have we made?
At the time, this idea was relatively unheard of. Yet Ben and Jerry's continued to see success and remains to this day one of the most beloved ice cream brands in the world. I always find myself fascinated by examples where the ethical and practical are creatively combined. For Ben Cohen, this came from asking how they could use their company to serve their community. Creative, radical, and yet simple solutions followed. Turns out we may be able to build more sustainable lives and communities if we could find our way to asking better, more challenging questions.
Mars is a $40 billion food and beverage company headquartered just outside of Washington, D.C. I was working in the headquarters at that time.
That's Jay Jakub, currently Chief Advocacy Officer for the Economics of Mutuality, a company based in Geneva, Switzerland, that seeks to explore alternative business practices. This particular interview was taped at one of our Live Tokens podcast events as a part of the Business as Mission conference in Nashville. Jay is here recounting an experience he had during his tenure at Mars Corporation, one of the largest food and beverage companies in the world. While working there, he became aware of a question, one which, at a company that size, many would see as at least unusual, if not downright monetarily blasphemous.
One of the leaders of the branches of the family, he asked his CEO a very unusual question, which is, what should the right level of profit be for the corporation?
Did you hear that? The right level of profit. In much contemporary economic thought, this suggestion that a limitless maximization of profit might not be in a company's best interest is practical heresy. In fact, many business schools have the so-called Friedman doctrine, named after economist Milton Friedman, who insisted that the sole social responsibility of a business was simply to increase its profits, that businesses had no social responsibility to society or the public. Its only responsibility is to increase profits for the sake of owners and shareholders.
And you have to remember contextually that Milton Friedman introduced financial capitalism, which is now the dominant model operating in all businesses virtually around the world. It's the model that's taught in all business schools as almost the only model that's taught. But it was actually created about 50 years ago in 1970. And that's when the context of the world was very different than it is today. There was a scarcity at that time in the global economy of money, but there was a surplus of natural resources and there was a surplus of labor. Okay, so it's not surprising that an economist, and economics is really about the management of scarcity, so you would have an economist come in with a model to address that scarcity, that form of scarcity. Well, financial capitalism has been so successful in addressing that form of scarcity that now we have this massive dysfunctional amount of money in the global economy, and we have the inverse of the forms of scarcity. So today, the real forms of scarcity are natural resources and their talent matching the jobs that are being created in the new knowledge economy with a different set of rules of the game. So why is it that we would forge ahead with a very almost primitive form of capitalism that was meant to address a form of scarcity that doesn't exist? It's time to really create a more complete form of capitalism by enlarging the definition of performance to include not only financial capital in businesses, but also other forms of capital that are non-financial in nature, but that have significant value, like social capital, human capital, and natural capital. And those forms of capital are actually the building blocks of the economics of mutuality.
So the question stands, what is the right level of profit?
When we first got that question, we thought, okay, we're an internal think tank of a major multinational corporation, so let's go do our research. So we went and did a kind of a literature review around the world to try to see what everyone else has done to address the question of the right level of profit. We found absolutely nothing. So we started to think, is this a new question that mankind has never wrestled with before? But then we started to think kind of in historical terms. And actually, we found something that King Solomon said, King Solomon the Wise, which is, I think in like 950 BC. It was just extraordinary what he said, which is a man may give freely and still his wealth may be increased. Another may keep back more than is right and still come to be in need.
Maybe that could be summed up this way. Hold on to too much and you may end up in need. Give away more and you may end up with yet more.
So this is in the book of Proverbs, and this was, thousands of years ago, really King Solomon addressing this question of what the right level of profit should be. So we started thinking this is not a new question. This is actually a very old question that mankind kind of put aside for the 50 years of Milton Friedman, and now it's time to really revisit that question. When you think about the history of economies and prosperity, there's really three aspects that always are consistent. One is the land that provides, then there's the labor that transforms and adds value, and then there's the money, the financial capital that actually is there to create liquidity in the system. These forms of capital are very distinctive from one another, but they're not remunerated in the same ways.
That is, these three forms of capital, land, labor, money are each essential in various economic models, but they have not been each sufficiently valued in those various economic models.
And really, if you think about the different ideologies, economic systems that were put into place to try to address each one of these three variables that I mentioned. First, you had sort of Marxism that was built on the half-truth of the fact that people needed to come first. Okay, there's truth in that, but they tried to remunerate one form of capital, which was really people, at the expense of the other two, which was the planet and profit. They really destroyed the planet in many ways, and also destroyed the ability of corporations to be self-sustaining and profitable by really making it difficult to create prosperity through financial profit. Then you had financial capitalism come along, and their half-truth was that you wanted to remunerate financial capital, but at the expense of people and at the expense of the planet. And then you had this sort of third half-truth, which is the environmental movement, which is becoming more and more powerful out there. And they've got their own sort of economic approach if they're given the opportunity to implement it. And it's really about putting the planet above everything else and remunerating the planet at the expense of people and profit. And, our belief in the very beginning, which really drove us at the start, before we had all the business data, was that really we need to find a way to remunerate each one of these pillars of land, labor, and financial capital by what it brings to the table, and that there's a truth in the wholeness of bringing these three aspects of the economy together. And just focusing on one at the expense of the other two is only a half-truth.
Related to all that, then, you all often use the word purpose. So when you speak of purpose in business, what does that mean and entail?
Yeah, that's a really big question, and it's one that CEOs of corporations and shareholders and others are really wrestling with right now. And I kind of look at purpose in a corporation as something that's become almost a Ponzi scheme of purpose, where it becomes all about the reputation of the corporation and creating something that's really aspiring and really unattainable for that corporation, because the corporation that creates these kinds of really exciting types of purpose statements often don't connect it to strategy in their organization.
So it's compelling marketing, but not necessarily something that's driving.
That doesn't happen everywhere, but it happens in a lot of places. And one of the signs of that is when purpose is just put into the hands solely of corporate affairs and communications. Now, corporate affairs and communications has a really important role, don't get me wrong, in this, but if purpose is disconnected from strategy, then it's going to be very difficult to deliver purpose, because there's no connection to the incentive system in the corporation that drives management behavior to actually deliver what you say your purpose is. Really, if you follow the Milton Friedman model, which again almost all companies do, all those incentives are geared towards delivering maximized financial returns to investors. So I love this quote by C.S. Lewis, who many of you have probably read, where he actually talked about purpose as being like a light. And that he said that if when you turn on a light in a dark room, you don't do that and then stare at the light. You actually look at what the light illuminates, okay? And I think this is really insightful of C.S. Lewis, because when you look at purpose as something that's just meant to be aspirational and disconnected from your ability to deliver it through strategy, what you're doing is you're asking everybody to look at the light, to stare at the light itself, and not at actually all the brokenness and the opportunities, actually, the growth opportunities that come with problems that are in your ecosystem of stakeholders. And so really connecting purpose in a very deliberate and meaningful way with strategy, making it much more holistic in terms of bringing in the finance aspect of a corporation, bringing in the HR part of the organization as well, and looking for ways to practically implement it. That's the way that you're actually going to succeed in orchestrating solutions to the problems of your stakeholder, which will actually supercharge your returns, your performance.
To summarize Jay's argument, the problem with contemporary capitalism is not that it seeks financial profit per se, but that it fails to recognize that financial capital is not the only form of capital that needs to be valued or compensated. There are, he argues, three kinds of capital: land, or the so-called environment, people, or so-called labor, and money, credit, or so-called financial capital. Capitalism prioritizes financial capital and too often ignores land and people. But Jay's research has led to another key observation. When we refuse to take seriously the ill effects of such a single-minded economic philosophy, we end up shorting ourselves. Put ironically, if we focus all of our efforts on financial profit, we wind up profiting less financially, while causing harm, potentially vast harm, to other aspects of both individual and communal life.
And if you start to utilize these non-financial forms of value, these non-financial forms of capital, human, social, and natural capital, you find also that there's this strong correlation between how much you grow those forms of capital and how much economic performance is released in a business activity. So they're all interconnected in a very deep manner, but businesses ignore that. They ignore the value of human, social, and natural capital because they think it's too fuzzy, and they don't realize there's this connection with value creation that also pays off in terms of financial value.
As a professor, I'm a theology geek, and we theology geeks know when we hear these sorts of ideas that these ideas have been around a really long time. And Jay himself has a PhD in history from Oxford University, so I asked him about some of his sources.
Was really found in the Old Testament in maybe what many would think was an unlikely place. I was talking to somebody the other day, last night actually, who was a pastor, and he said, you're talking about Leviticus chapter 25 as being the inspiration for an economic model? Leviticus, is that something we really want to spend a lot of time on?
Now,
right.
Yeah.
And when I took another look at Leviticus, and if you remember anything about Leviticus 25, it's really laying out God's Jubilee, and it talks about how God remunerates people, planet, and profit, really with rest. He remunerates people with 1 day of a Sabbath out of every 7, remunerates the land with 1 year of rest out of every 7, and remunerates capital, financial capital, every 49 years, 7 times 7 years for 1 year, which gives us that 50-year Jubilee cycle. So that was really the inspiration that came from this work. But the more that I work on this, I find that I often am speaking in biblical terms, but I'm not sourcing it necessarily in that way, because I believe it's truth, and I believe when the truth comes out, that it never comes back empty. And so when you're repositioning companies through a business model management innovation away from simply extracting value from its stakeholders and trying to keep for themselves, with that kind of lie, I think, that's out there, which is if you want to have for yourself, you need to take from others and keep it, right? That ultimately is where financial capitalism has put us in many ways after 50 years, 1 Jubilee cycle, interestingly, of financial capitalism. But really, it's about focusing on the means, economics of mutuality, how you treat the others. If your end is profit maximization for yourself, you need to put that aside. That can't be your motivator. The ends do not justify the means. This is all about focusing on the means, being faithful in the small things, orchestrating solutions to the problems of your neighbor, okay, really in its most literal sense. And it really demonstrates in very practical ways with real business data that it's better to give than to receive. Because when you actually orchestrate solutions to the problems of your stakeholders around a purpose that's actionable, what you're doing is you're creating a much more healthy ecosystem of stakeholders, and that create a much greater holistic performance, including financial performance, even in the short term. So everyone actually gets a double blessing in this if you focus on the means and not on the ends. There's a natural order to everything, including a natural order for the economy. And so the natural order of the economy, as I understand it, is that financial capital is important, but it's at the bottom of the hierarchy.
You're listening to No Small Endeavor and our episode with Ben Cohen and Jay Jakub. We're going to take a short break, but coming right up, we hear from Ben about the various ways he has used his business platform for justice.
The other thing that we realized is that probably business's most powerful tool is its voice. That when business speaks, the press listens, the politicians listen, the community listens. And so we've been trying to use that voice for justice.
Again, that's Ben Cohen of Ben and Jerry's Ice Cream. Being co-founder of a beloved company has indeed afforded him a voice in the public sphere, which he has used to be vocal on a number of areas of injustice.
We kind of believe in justice, and we also believe that he who is silent consents. So I feel like when you become aware of situations of injustice, you can either ignore it, you can complain about it, or you can do something about it.
This posture to employ one's voice granted by one's business success in service to issues related to community justice is praised by some, denounced by others. Thinking about critique, how do you deal with it?
I expect critique. I mean, that's part of taking a stand. And if the stand that you take does not generate criticism, there was no need to take the stand to begin with. I mean, if everybody already agrees with it,
that's pretty great.
I don't need to say anything about it.
That's really helpful. So with that sort of presumption, combined with the presumption that business ought not be ignorant of larger social and personal concerns, Ben and Jerry have spoken up about some hotly contested matters. Ben's most recent book, for example, was about police violence. It's entitled Above the Law, How Qualified Immunity Protects Violent Police. It's a short but sharp critique of the U.S. legal principle called qualified immunity. For those who aren't aware, could you just kind of give a definition of qualified immunity?
I think the best definition is that, if I haul off and punch you in the face, you can sue me. If a policeman does it, your case will be thrown out of court, because police have, this judicial doctrine called qualified immunity. And essentially what qualified immunity says is that if a cop commits an illegal act, if the cop violates your constitutional rights, that cop will get off scot-free unless there was another cop in the past in the same jurisdiction who had done essentially the same thing and gotten convicted. Then you could actually sue the cop. But if not, the cop gets away with it.
So the more general legal principle of a suit based upon violation of constitutional rights, in effect, is inconsequential in these cases.
It's thrown out by the judge unless the victim can show that essentially exactly the same thing happened previously in exactly the same jurisdiction and the cop was convicted.
And then how did such a law or principle come to be?
It's pretty interesting how qualified immunity came to be. It's based on an interpretation of a federal law that was passed during Reconstruction. What happened was that in the South, a lot of the police were still members of the Ku Klux Klan, and they would brutalize and abuse Black people. And so the federal government passed a law specifically stating that if an employee of the state, a policeman, violates your civil rights, you can sue that policeman personally in court. And that worked well for a while. And then there was a Supreme Court decision that essentially undermined that law. And it said that, well, the only circumstance in which you can sue that cop who violated your rights is if there had been a previous case where a cop had been convicted. I mean, the theory of it is that a cop, otherwise known as a law enforcement officer, is not expected to know the law. Think about that. And so what this judicial doctrine said was the only way you can expect a cop to know something's illegal is if another cop was previously convicted for doing that illegal act. It doesn't make sense. It's crazy. It's absurd. And it is the reason why we see so many examples of police abusing going so far as to murder unarmed black people and getting away with it scot-free.
One striking reality worth observing here: many of Ben and Jerry's positions, including the critique of police violence, are often thought of as being on the socio-political left. Yet in Ben's critique of this legal principle of qualified immunity that appears to protect police abuse of power, organizations on the socio-political right are also engaged in this same critique. So the Cato Institute on the right has taken up this cause, as has the ACLU on the left. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas on the so-called right has critiqued this legal precedent, as has Justice Sotomayor on the so-called left.
And it is really great to find an area of common ground, an area of agreement. And it's just based on basic justice and reason and rationality.
And yet still, the principle has great legal sway. Have you been critiqued for being anti-police?
Oh, very much. We've been very much critiqued as being anti-police, and it's not true. I mean, we believe that it's necessary to have police in a society, but you can still support the idea that, yes, we should have a police force, but no, they should not brutalize people and they should be held accountable. That's what we're trying to do, is to have some accountability. I mean, why should law enforcement officers be above the law?
But Ben Cohen's efforts for justice go beyond just one issue. For example, broader efforts at international peacemaking, or critiques of what he sees as inordinate military spending, both of which obviously reconnect to issues of business and money. The question of what money is for, ought to be for, or ought to be available for, which leads him to positions like this.
Well, I mean, in terms of the stuff that people really need, education, healthcare, housing, just money to go out and have a good time, it's all being sucked up by the military-industrial complex. What Americans need to realize is that it is America that is leading the arms race. You read the newspaper and it says, oh my God, China is building some new weapons system. We need to spend more to catch up. Russia is building some new thing. Oh, they're getting militarized. I mean, the reality is that those countries are spending 1/6 of what the U.S. spends, or 1/12. They're trying to catch up with us. They're scared that the U.S. has the capability of blowing up the entire world many times over. So, if you look at our discretionary budget, that's the amount of money that Congress has available each year to spend. Over 50% of it goes to the Pentagon. We can't conceive of the magnitude of the amount of money that's going into the Pentagon. It's over $2 billion a day. For 15% of the Pentagon budget, we could provide food for all the people around the country, around the world, including our own country, that don't have enough food. We could provide health care for all the people around the world that don't have enough health care. We have gobs and gobs and gobs of money. We're just spending it in the wrong places. I mean, do we really think that some country wants to invade the United States? I mean, think about this. The United States is the most powerful military force in the world, and we're not able to occupy Iraq or Afghanistan. some other country is going to try and occupy us. It ain't going to happen.
Taking public stances on social justice issues can often obviously be a serious endeavor, but Ben has managed to maintain a sense of humor about it all. He recounts some of his creative ways of engaging the world in a book he co-authored with his co-founder Jerry. It's called Ben and Jerry's Double Dip: How to Run a Values-Led Business and Make Money Too. He also recounts there that traditional education was hard for him. Bluntly put, he found it boring to serious. So as a college professor myself, of course, I had to ask about this. Early in your career, college experience was not so great for you?
Yeah, I'm not a real good classroom learner. That is not my preferred learning style. I love to learn.
Yeah, so advice for college professors.
Advice for college professors? Well, college professors should continue to profess. I think they should understand that the job is kind of about performance, and that they need to, present in ways that are interesting and, well, just interesting and engaging.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Because I think that I finally learned that lesson after I started putting on a variety show. And I realized how much better one can teach by thinking of the classroom experience as a performance. So yeah, that's very helpful feedback. One of the things that's fascinating to me is that you and Jerry seem to have been intentional about holding the playful along with the social witness. So reading your story about your fall festival when you started out early in Burlington, you and your alter identity, the noted mystic Habini Ben Cohen.
Yeah. Jerry went to Oberlin. He went through 4 years straight at Oberlin College, and they set up this experimental college while he was there, where the courses were taught by students. Huh. And he took a course in carnival technique, and he learned how to smash a cinder block on somebody's stomach with a sledgehammer while they were suspended between two chairs. So he came out of that course with flying colors. He said, let's do this act. Do you want to be the guy with the sledgehammer or the guy with the cinder block? And I was not confident enough in my aim. And so I said, I'll be the guy with the cinder block. And he's gone around. So the Habini Abdul Ben Cohen, part of the gig, the act is that I am presented as Habini Abdul Ben Cohen Wa, the noted Indian mystic, who was able to survive the destruction of the temple at Rishikesh by placing himself into a metabolic trance as the temple crumbled down about him. And I would simulate that for you here today.
No accidents.
No, I survived.
Yeah. Have you thought much systematically about how holding the playful and the serious works together?
I think that, there's a quote up on the wall of my office that says, if I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution. That's from Emma Goldman. So, yes, it's got to be fun. It's got to be enjoyable. The joyful journey for justice. I mean, if it is all doom and gloom and a slog and no fun and serious, who the hell wants to do it?
You've been listening to No Small Endeavor, and our episode with Ben Cohen of Ben & Jerry's and Jay Jakub of Economics of Mutuality. We gratefully acknowledge the support of Lilly Endowment Incorporated, a private philanthropic foundation supporting the causes of community development, education, and religion, and the support of the John Templeton Foundation, whose vision is to become a global catalyst for discoveries that contribute to human flourishing. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carrie Harmon, Ellis Osborne, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.